new link that I sent you. So if you can, well, if you can actually check it first, check to see if that you can see me.
So you're like pre.
There you are.
Okay.
So you're on YouTube right now watching it. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So that unfortunately is the link. Is this, you're gonna have to send out to people.
No problem.
I'm not gonna stop it. This is the video. Thank you all for tuning in to our video.
All right, so here we are, where you are. Oh, it's a little behind. You've already moved away.
It's a lot because it's for December.
Okay. Good. Well, we can see everything I can. That's great. It's working. That's all I care about.
For the encoder.
Wow. I think maybe you could go up a little. No, that's good. That's good.
Wait, have you sent it?
Yes. The new link?
Yeah.
Because you got the old one working?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Let me. We can have both.
You could have both. That's actually not bad. Do both. That way, people who didn't get that.
Oh wait, I didn't get to it. It's.
All right. So now
we can do two.
so we can talk to people.
I don't think.
Hi everyone. If you're on live stream, we're going to be with you in a few minutes. We're starting in like a few more minutes.
Did you test audio on the webcast?
I don't know how to do that. Whenever you're ready, we're already deciding to set the live stream. So we're all set. All right, hi, how are you? Good to see you. You're so sweet. Come on here. Thank you. Which part about the spokesperson? Yeah. Sort of, yeah, just the media and the spokesperson. Everybody has their own media access. So it would be tricky to try to get anyone to agree to this in the point of contact for media. But I don't mind there being multiple. They all do different. All right, to be continued. I think we're ready.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to the New York Society for Ethical Culture and the monthly general meeting of 350 NYC. Thank you for joining us this evening. I think you will not be disappointed. It's going to be a very interesting and educational program. We're going to get started right away. We're going to honor the agenda and the schedule we're trying to keep because there's a lot to pack in. So I'm going to introduce the person who's going to introduce our speaker. And we'll get started. Todd Fernandez was formerly General Counsel and Legislative Director for the Massachusetts Executive Office of Economic Affairs, where he led the legal team that wrote and passed the Henry Brownfields Act of 1998. More recently, he led the strategy to file the LGBTQ Equality Act, which passed the U.S. House this year, He attended Boston University School of Law and has a master's in law and human rights and democracy from the University of Victoria, South Africa. Todd has been active with many grassroots organizations and direct action groups, and he's currently working with the steering committee of 350 NYC. He's co-leading the People's Green New Deal and Media Task Force projects. Please welcome Todd to the
Thank you, everyone. Welcome. It's great to have everyone here. We're embarked on a very exciting project because we are in a climate emergency, as everyone knows. So the focus of the project that we're going to be talking about and the presentation today is about coming up with federal legislation and building a movement to pass such legislation. We've created at 350 the People's Green New Deal Working Group, particularly for this topic. So federal demands, as most people know, are key to policy change and to movement building. So until now, there has not really been much of a federal legislative agenda in the climate movement, and we're hoping that's going to change. But you can see other examples of how important these ideas are. Affordable Care Act, everyone's heard of that. There was a big movement behind that. Comprehensive immigration reform, and the Dreamers have a bill. You've heard of those. There's a reason why these bills captured the public imagination and made their way. The LGBT Equality Act that I worked on is now the centerpiece of that movement. Medicare for All is quite popular. And the Green New Deal resolution in the construct has now emerged on the climate stage, and that's gotten a whole new level of excitement and enthusiasm and pressure on Congress to take action for this emergency. But as you can see in this slide, only 3% of people know a lot about the Green New Deal resolution, 14 a little, and 82% nothing at all. So we have a very long way to go. Building a Green New Deal bill and a movement requires a process. In my opinion, you can't just come up with a bill internally and drop it on a movement and hope that that movement's going to respond and be there for it. So there are thousands of environmental groups out there. Individually, in my assessment, we've been powerless to make a great deal of change, but collectively, I think we could, given the moment that we face and the emergency that we're facing, topple the oligarchy that controls our government, but only if we unite. So there are a couple efforts in this regard. One is New Consensus, working with Senator Sanders and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and they're drafting currently a Green New Deal bill, which is supposedly going to come out early next year. Senator Sanders is going to be the sponsor. That process is happening, but it's not happening with a great deal of transparency or grassroots engagement. So having been a grassroots activist myself for many years and believing that only the grassroots can drive the agenda that we need to drive ultimately to success, we created the People's Green New Deal Working Group to make sure that grassroots activists and the environmental community at large has a say in what goes into a bill and is then engaged in trying to pass it. So we're doing this through open meetings online. We have the first Monday of every month. We have a Zoom meeting so people around the country can participate. And then on the third Wednesday of every month, we meet here at Ethical Culture for an in-person meeting. We have a wide array of activist participation, activists representing over 20 different groups. The groups themselves are not specifically endorsed the project, which is fine, we didn't ask them to. We were more interested in getting the expertise of the activists who are leaders in those organizations to come together. And we've been very successful in doing that. I'm happy to report. You're going to hear from some of them today, and you're going to hear more about that after our main presentation. Currently, we're in the phase of researching and soliciting proposals from the environmental movement at large. We've sent out emails to over 500 organizations, and individuals in our working group are compiling them by proactively researching the policy in their areas. We have a public document with a Google spreadsheet that's open to everyone to look at. It shows our team and all the various sectors I'm going to go over in a minute. And we'll have those results online on our website in due course, so that way there will be a more visible way for the public at large to provide input, comments, additional suggestions that we may have not come across. We're hoping to complete this by the fall of 2019, and then we'll launch a public awareness campaign about the results, and hopefully then the results of this will influence all the bill drafting that's going on, and we'll talk more about that later. We also want to translate it into pressure for the DNC platform discussions, which will take place next year. There was discussion about the platform last year in climate. We want it to be more thorough this time, and we're going to translate it into candidate questionnaires for all the candidates. We're using the Drawdown 100, which many people are familiar with, as a scoping document, if you will. Sort of creates the outline of the topics that we're researching. That particular document was compiled based on the sources of greenhouse gases, and so then correspondingly, it is a great outline to what we need to do to eliminate those greenhouse gas sources. And you can see the topics. It's much broader than electric generation, which most people are familiar with, and we spend a lot of time talking about that. A big piece of it is food and ag, buildings and cities, land use, oceans and forests, transportation, women's rights and education of girls, materials and recycling is a huge topic. We've then also added environmental justice and just transition, finance and tax policy, a business section, and we have the 2020 candidates proposals also on the spreadsheet so you can compare all of these things. Here's what Drawdown shows you, just so you can see the percentage of CO2 reductions by category that are possible and necessary. And from this you can see how big food is as an issue. And we have a whole coalition of people from the Food and Ag Department being led by Friends of the Earth who are working on policy suggestions from that sector. Then we have a lot of people on electricity, land use, materials. You can see all the sectors. And I have that in here just to point out that this is a much broader issue and a broader problem. And so we have to really be mindful that we're looking at the full scope of the problem when we're coming up with the scope of the solutions. This just gives you a quick glance of the first 30 or so proposals that we've gathered already to let you know that there is a plethora of opinions out there about how to solve all these problems, which is a wonderful thing to have. And we're trying to then we will bring all these ideas into our spreadsheet. We're going to list the specific proposal by topic that's on there, and then we'll cross-reference it to all the proposals that have that same proposed solution. So the results of this will then be a list of ideas, and you will know what kind of public support there is from the environmental community and grassroots community. And my hope is that that's going to lead us to understand that we have much more in common in terms of what we believe are necessary solutions and actions than we have disagreements. And you really wouldn't know that from listening to much of the debate, which has kept the environmental community at odds with one another and not unified behind a comprehensive federal solution. This leads us into one of the main proposals, and this is going to be the presentation of our keynote today, Michael Gerrard. Columbia University's Saban Center for Climate Change Law has created this document, which is really good exercise. It's called The Legal Pathways to Deep Decarbonization in the United States. It's peer-reviewed with expert authors, over 1,000 pages, 35 chapters with detailed policy proposals, and a team of top New York law firms are drafting legislation to correspond to these proposals, and you're going to hear all about it. This is a core source for the People's Green New Deal working group that we're working on, along with the others that I presented. So now I'll introduce Michael Gerrard. He is the founder and director of the Saban Center for Climate Change at Columbia University. He was formerly the faculty chair of Columbia's Earth Institute, which many people are familiar with. He chaired the environmental sections of the American Bar Association, the New York State and New York City Bar Associations at different times. He was formerly a partner and now a senior counsel at Arnold & Porter. He's the author of or editor of 13 books on environmental law, brownfields, global climate change, and clean energy, and a graduate of Columbia University and New York University School of Law. So without further ado, I welcome Michael Gerrard up. Please join me in welcoming him. One second.
Thank you, Todd. It's an honor to be here with you. I'm going to talk a little bit about the technical underpinnings of this book that Todd just told you about, and then some of the legal components and where we are going next. So, 5 years ago, a series of reports came out on pathways to deep decarbonization. They looked at the 16 largest emitting economies in the world and tried to figure out how the world could be on a 2-degree pathway. Since then, we've learned that we need to be more ambitious, but this looked at a 2-degree pathway. And for each of these countries, they sketched out what they would need to do. This is their sketch of what contribution, what the emissions would be from each of these 16 countries out to 2050. So the top line is a pathway to 2 degrees. The bottom is China, the world's largest emitting country, and this shows China's emissions peaking in 2030, which is what they have promised. Next up is India. Now, if India's emissions were on a per capita basis were to be the same as China, it'd be much wider than that. This is what the assumption was. Above that is the US. And this shows that the US absolutely has to neck down its greenhouse gas emissions radically, and if we don't, we'll never get there. You know, we often hear the argument that, well, why should we do anything if India and China aren't? There are many responses to that. One of them is the U.S. absolutely has to greatly reduce its emissions. One of the findings of the analysis is that it is important not to reduce emissions in a way that locks you in, that leads to a dead end. And the particular concern here is natural gas. That if we achieve a lot of our emissions reductions by switching to natural gas, you do reduce emissions for a while, but then you're stuck with continued emissions of this important source of greenhouse gases. So there are 3 pillars behind the technical report: energy efficiency, decarbonization of the electricity supply, so moving entirely away from fossil fuels, and switching liquid fuels to electricity, led by the transport sector and by heating and cooling of buildings and water. So the report, the technical report on which we based our work, found that this could all be done for a net cost of less than 1% of gross domestic product. It concluded that almost complete decarbonization of the electricity supply would be necessary and is possible by 2050. If we electrify the transport sector and heating and cooling and various industrial uses and so forth, we're going to need almost a doubling of the electricity supply. This is even after a very aggressive program of energy efficiency. And so that has a lot of implications for the path forward. And so we need to switch liquid gaseous uses to non-fossil sources. And another part of the report is respecting the normal turnover time for equipment. So light bulbs, people change light bulbs fairly frequently, so switching all lights to LEDs can be done fairly quickly. Hot water heaters get changed out every maybe 15 years or so. And so we look at each of the various devices here. Nobody's going to have to retire their appliances before the end of their useful life, but when you do, you need to switch to an electric and highly efficient appliance. Likewise with cars, people don't have to get rid of their cars, but the next car should be electric car. So we see here the internal combustion engine in brown. That is almost entirely phased out. The only ones that are left by 2050 are the old ones that people haven't gotten rid of yet. And the same with diesel, and they're replaced with electric or in some cases hydrogen vehicles. We see that the electricity supply has to go way up, but the portion of it provided by fossil fuel in gray goes way down, and the only part that is left is if it has carbon capture and sequestration. The growth of electricity is from renewables, predominantly wind, solar. So if we look at New York, and I just want to spend a few minutes talking about New York, 1/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions in the state come from transportation. We hear so much about electricity, as Todd said, but only 13% of the greenhouse gas emissions in New York State come from the generation of electricity. If you include net imports, it's 17%. But residential and commercial are 16 and 10%. So they add up to much more than electricity. And that is mostly natural gas and oil for heating spaces and water. And then we have all of these other smaller emission sources, some of which are very tough to get rid of. One of the difficulties of getting down to zero. So you all know that last Thursday, Governor Cuomo signed this major new law. Fordham Law School, just a couple of blocks from here. I was at the ceremony down in Newark, joined Cuomo, and working off a baseline of 1990, we are now about 8.5 or 9% below what 1990 levels were. 2030, we need to be 40% below, and 2050, 85%. Now, these are not just aspirations; these are legally binding, and the law makes it clear that the State Department of Environmental Conservation and other state agencies need to enact legally binding, enforceable regulations to make sure that this happens. There's the aspiration of 100% net zero emissions, but legally binding is 85%. The law, again, legally binding, the electricity sector has to be 70% from renewables by 2030 and 100% from zero emissions by 2040. The difference between renewables and zero emissions is nuclear. I'll say more than that. There are minimum requirements for efficiency. We need to have 6 gigawatts of distributed solar. We now have 1.5 gigawatts. To put in perspective, a large nuclear power plant generates about 1 gigawatt. So this is the equivalent of, this is 6 nuclear power plants worth of mostly rooftop solar. 3 gigawatts of energy storage, we have almost none of that. 9 gigawatts of offshore wind, we have none of that in New York State. Last week, they also announced 2 big wind farms off south coast of Long Island, adding up to 1.7 gigawatts. Good start, but we need a whole lot more than that. So right now, the electricity mix in New York State is like this: 39% fossil, 32% nuclear, 23% hydro, just 6% non-hydro renewables. That's solar and wind, and a little bit of geothermal. So by 2030, it needs to be 70% to existing, what counts would be the 23 hydro and 6 non-hydro, 29. So we've got to go from 29 to 70 by 2030, and by 2040, has to be 100%. You add in the nuclear, and that gets to 61%. But most of the nuclear is going to be gone by 2040. Indian Point shutting down in the next couple of years. There are 4 smaller upstate nuclear power plants. 3 of them will have their licenses, their extended licenses, and will expire by then. So this is almost entirely going to have to be met by wind and solar and hydro. So Todd showed you the book that we prepared. And so what we did, my co-editor, John Dernbach, and I asked the question, how does U.S. law need to change in order to be on this pathway? Federal, state, and local. We put together a team of about 50 lawyers from around the country, mostly law professors, some private practitioners, some in NGOs, put together a book of 35 chapters, each of them going into considerable detail on what is the current legal and regulatory situation with respect to a given sector, and making a lot of recommendations for federal and state and local action. So just to give you a sense of what's covered, so we have a lot of, each of these bullets is a chapter. So we have a lot of chapters on energy efficiency, conservation, and fuel switching. So it talks about light duty vehicles, heavy duty, transportation demand, aviation, shipping, old buildings, new buildings, the industrial sector. In New York, the biggest challenge, certainly in the city, is going to be the old buildings. You know, as you all know, in April, the City Council passed the building emissions law, which is going to require very major reductions in emissions from buildings in New York City. The state law will have a similar requirement that's going to be heavy lift in getting that done. But that's central to what New York does. So for light-duty vehicles, the principal role there is at the federal level, and of course Trump is trying to relax the federal standards. Hopefully he won't be able to get away with that. That'll be stopped in court, and hopefully then the next president will undo it. So there's a central federal role for light-duty vehicles. In New York, we need to create a large electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And we have some control over, the land use patterns. So, electricity decarbonization. I wrote the chapter on utility scale renewables, and as I said, we need just a massive ramp up of renewables, major new projects being built each and every year out to the year 2050 and beyond. This too is going to be a major challenge, acquiring the land, doing the designs, getting through the approval processes, the environmental review processes. Some modifications are going to be needed to do it at that scale. We need to, one of the things I say is that we no longer have the opportunity to say we don't want to see wind turbines, and we can't block wind turbines because people no longer look at it. We need wind turbines everywhere. We need solar everywhere. We need just this massive increase. Likewise, with distributed renewables, we need massive amounts of that. Transmission, distribution to get the power from where it's generated, which is often remotely rural areas, to places like the city where it's needed. We can get into a discussion about nuclear. That's a whole other topic. I'm not assuming any new nuclear is, but hydro is currently an important part of the New York picture. Continue, and we talk about the ways to phase out the fossil fuel uses that we have. Fuel decarbonization, moving away from liquid fuels, trying to use biomass to the extent possible to create zero carbon gas that can be used for those uses that can't be electrified, especially in the transport sector. Carbon capture and negative emissions, as much of it as possible through soils, through natural measures, through agriculture, soil management, forestry, but that's not going to be enough. We're also going to need other ways of direct air capture. The non-CO2 carbon pollutants, black carbon, methane, fluorinated gases, and nitrous oxides, which are also in themselves important contributors to climate change, and then cross-cutting approaches. And of course, the most important of these by far is a price on carbon. And that ideally would be imposed at the federal level, although some states have modest prices on carbon in various ways. But the single most important thing that can be done is a substantial price on carbon imposed at the federal level. It is necessary, but it is not sufficient. A lot more is going to be needed. Even if we do have a substantial price on carbon, a lot more is going to be needed in order to meet our objectives. And we also talk about behavior, technological innovation, various other financing, and all of these other factors. So it's not all just regulation. It's a whole host of different techniques. Some of them are through incentives, some of them are through information, some of them are through taking away obstacles, through insurance and R&D. A whole host of actions are needed in order to make this happen. And so the key findings: legal tools are available, or they could be readily created if the politics were right, to achieve the objectives. We've identified more than 1,500 specific recommendations in federal, state, and local with a wide variety of tools. They create many different benefits in addition to the reduction in greenhouse gases. So we see this project as really having 4 stages. The first stage was the technical work, the one that was done by the engineers and scientists who set forth the technical pathways that needed to be followed. The second phase is what we did, is doing this book, coming up with all these very specific recommendations. The third phase, which we have just started, and as Todd mentioned, is that we want to have take the recommendations in the book and turn them into legislation, turn them into bills. And so we launched a project to recruit lawyers, mostly in big law firms, to do the drafting. So far, 20 large law firms have signed up. Most of them are taking one chapter a piece, some of them are taking two, some of them are taking a portion of the chapter. And so we've asked each of the firms that is participating to divide the recommendations into the most important third, the middle third, and the bottom third. The most important third, we want the first drafts in 3 months, then the second third, 3 months after that, the third 3 months after that. We're going to subject each of these chapters to rigorous peer review by other lawyers and by technical experts. This book, all the chapters in this went through peer review, and we want to do that with the legislation as well. We are trying to line up more law firms. If any of you have connections with big law firms that might be interested in participating, send them to me, and I'll be happy to talk to them. We also want to line up expert peer reviewers, and please, anybody who might be interested in that, please contact me as well. An additional project that we at the Saban Center for Climate Change Law have started is that one of the major obstacles to ramping up renewables at the necessary pace, as we've alluded to, is in some places you get local opposition. Some places there are neighbors who don't want to look at these things or otherwise don't want. But they need to get built if we're going to solve the climate crisis. So we've started something called the Renewable Energy Legal Defense Initiative, whose purpose is to provide pro bono legal assistance to community groups and individuals who want wind and solar and the associated transmission and storage, but that are facing local opposition. So the law firm where I was a partner for many years, Arnold & Porter, has seconded one of its senior litigation associates, Laura Cottingham, spent half her time for this year to handle this case. We've already brought a suit against one upstate town that banned utility scale solar. We're representing some farmers who wanted to lease their land to a solar developer, but the town said they can't stop it. So we're suing the town and trying to reverse that. We're also just took on representation of somebody who wants to build solar on top of his house, but their homeowners association is saying they can't do it. We're trying to take away these legal barriers that have arisen to renewables. And if any of you know of instances where this kind of help might be useful, let us know. The price is right. It's all pro bono. So this is a sort of a summary of where we stand. The ideal solution would be the federal legislation that includes a price on carbon, that includes ways to expedite and expand and finance the construction of this massive program of building renewables, both utility scale and distributed, and the associated storage and transmission, and a law that makes it clear that the motor vehicle fleet has to be electrified, and all of these other things are done. But it's not going to happen without very serious citizen activism. And so when I said that our project has 4 phases, the 4th phase is to take these bills that we're drafting and get them passed. And that's a job for the citizens, for the environmental movement and everyone else who is interested in this to undertake. And so I'm delighted to be with you tonight. I'm very happy that all of you are working as hard as you are, and I'd be happy to address any questions. But I guess Todd is going to supervise the Q&A.
I could, sure, yes. Well, thank you, thank you. So I'll just just take 3 questions in a row, and then we'll let him respond to those, and we'll do 3. So, okay, we'll start in the back.
My name is Kasai, and I am interested in the regulations of carbon that involve carbon pricing. I'm very interested in the regulations. Like I was looking into HR 763, which has right now a big push from the climate condition law. I realized that they are lifting up EPA protection of clean air, for example. So for me, I am a scientist. For me, if we are going to use carbon pricing, which is a market-driven tool, I know that economics is not a science, then we need what you were alluding, many other ways to move the buildings, the efficiency, the transportation, etc. But my concern is that carbon pricing has to be strongly regulated. Like, for example, if we have an energy provider that is going to deal with renewables and with fossil fuels, the carbon pricing is going to be passed to consumers. And I am very aware that right now, the statistics is that 160 million of working Americans, that means 40% of working Americans, are struggling to pay their bills. So how are you going to push people into switching into renewables in a decade, for example? I noticed 70%. So my question, I want to summarize it. What is your position about the regulations of the energy providers, not to pass burden into consumers, especially
Got it,
for
got it.
percent?
All right, thank you very much. Who else had a hand up? Rachel.
Okay. You have blown me away. Thank you. Has anything like the project ever happened before? It seems extremely creative to me. And do Senator Saunders and Representative Cortez, do they know what you are doing? And what is their reaction?
Great question. Lalo?
Anything about ocean farming and other carbon capture methods that involve the ocean?
Okay, that's great.
Okay, so first with respect to a carbon price. So as I said, a carbon price alone won't do it. We need to have regulations. The carbon price is going to raise prices. And the question is who has to pay those? And that's largely a function of electricity. It's a matter of rate design. And so it is entirely possible some places have electric utilities have designed the electricity rates so that the poor pay a lot less and larger consumers pay a lot more. It's not going to work to require the energy companies just to absorb the cost because they're not going to. The whole system of electricity regulation is that the operating costs get passed through, and the utilities get a guaranteed modest, but they get a guaranteed rate of return. And so you can't tell Con Ed you're going to have to pay all of these added costs. So it will be passed along to consumers. But the way that that's done in the proportions is entirely a matter of policy. And what we're suggesting is that the policies be designed to minimize the impact on the poor and maximize the impact on the richest consumers. The second question is anything like this been done? Not really in the climate era, as we're aware of. I mean, there have been in the past, there were large numbers of boys organized to fight the Vietnam War, to press for nuclear non-proliferation, civil rights. There are many areas, women's rights. There are many areas where lawyers have gotten together. But in climate, there are a lot of lawyers have talked about it and signed statements, but this is the first organized effort. We have met with some of AOC's people, and they're very well aware of this, and I'm thinking about it as they design the legislation for the Green New Deal. On the issue of oceans, well, one of the techniques that has been talked about for carbon dioxide removal, ocean iron fertilization, there are a lot of concerns about that. We are not advocating that. That is not one of the recommendations. So we think that it probably deserves more work, but the downsides so far seem to exceed the upsides, and so we're looking forward to other methods for carbon dioxide removal.
Mark,
Yeah. My question is to do with the role of the utilities, and to what extent do we have policies that will incentivize the utility to take up a great proportion? Right now, the current dogma amongst environmentalists is that the utilities are dragging their feet and picking up solar. So, do you have policies in there incentivizing?
Yeah, one important piece of your proposal has to do with increasing efficiency. And increasing efficiency is great, but historically we know that increasing efficiency of energy production leads to greater consumption. And my question is really what way does your plan take into account or estimate projections of increased consumption, increased energy efficiency?
Cindy.
You touched on the issue of wind power, and I was on a debriefing call last week about the legislation, and there seemed to be a lot of localities trying to pass rules and legislation to keep wind power out of their communities. Do you think, given how much wind power, and I also heard that a couple of major producers of wind power are thinking about leaving New York State because they anticipate huge battles in this regard. Do you think the legal support that you talked about providing, which is fantastic, can that process move fast enough to, help move ahead the 7.3 additional gigawatts of wind power that we need in a relatively short period of time?
So first, with respect to utilities, so the renewable portfolio standards have been very effective in driving utilities to use more wind and solar. It becomes a legal mandate, and the new New York State law essentially it explicitly requires the Public Service Commission to come out with regulations to enforce the 70% by 2030 and 100% by 2040 requirements. So that is by statute required, done, and that is enforceable against the utility. With respect to energy efficiency, I look at it much differently. What you're referring to is called the rebound effect, also sometimes called the Jevons paradox, and the idea that if you're more efficient by energy, people will use more of it. And that is a more minor effect than has been portrayed. One meta-analysis that was published a couple of years ago said that on an overall basis, it might reduce the energy savings by about 25%, not 100%, not 150%. And so the calculations about the amount of energy efficiency savings that would be achieved, those calculations by the engineers and economists who did that did reflect that factor.
Just what about ordinary growth?
Ordinary growth in demand will happen, and so ordinary growth happens as a result of population growth and economic growth, and that is one of the reasons why we're going to need a doubling of the electricity supply to reflect both the ordinary growth and the electrification of uses that are now fossil, minus the savings through efficiency. With respect to wind, I mean, it's absolutely right that local opposition is a problem. And, this one lawsuit I mentioned is against the town that banned wind. New York State does have a law called Article 10 of the Public Service Law, which gives the state the authority to override these local bans. The state is very skittish about using it. They're afraid of the political backlash that will be. I think the state has to become more aggressive in using that authority, and it's very important for citizens to try to persuade towns that we really need these things. This is as you all reason you're here, you realize this is an existential threat, and we can't be stopping wind turbines because people don't like looking at them. So it's going to require a great deal of citizen mobilization in every town that has people stand up opposing wind. There should be 5 times as many people standing up in those towns and supporting it.
We have a question from the internet. Look how. Oh, sorry. See if I can read this. What about legal action versus fossil fuel companies for damage their products are doing? California cities have tried this. The West Coast Crab Fishermen's Association and the Children's Trust lawsuit. And then another question is, how can we get this book?
On the first question, yeah, there are now 15 lawsuits brought by mostly cities and counties, one state and the Pacific Fishermen's against the fossil fuel companies for money damages. 2 of them have been dismissed, one in New York City, one in San Francisco. Both of them are under appeal now to the courts of appeals. In 3 of the cases, the defendants moved the case to federal court, and the federal courts have just kicked it back to the state courts, which is where the plaintiffs want them to be. So this is litigation that's going to be playing out all across the country over the next year or 2 or 3. Needs to be watched very carefully. In terms of where to get the book, it's available on Amazon.
Right.
And I hope that many of you buy many copies.
All right, let's
Also
take this
available
side.
in ebook.
1, 2, and 3.
So, thanks for coming. It's like you said, you were blown away. I'm also super excited. So I want to talk about cost, overall cost. You had a slide pretty early on that I think the header said that the estimated cost of the overall transformation was 1% of GDP. So is that 1% of US GDP to transform the US part of the economy? Or is that 1% of US GDP? And then I guess also, is that 1% on an annual basis? Is that a 1% one-time cost? I'd just like you to maybe unpack that number a little bit. To me, it seems lower than other numbers I've seen. So I'm just curious as to kind of how you, arrive at that number and whether it's a one-time cost and what this is.
John?
Yes, even if we're able to make the energy shift in by 2030 or 50, do you think that we need to start looking at a regulation of the larger economy? That the economy that we are running right now is just that we need to figure out ways of making a grander change.
My question is about California, where I lived in the 1970s, and Jerry Brown had an office called the Office of Appropriate Technology. Some of my friends worked in it. He was way ahead of his time. So that was 1978, all these years later. Is California taking the lead as a state in taking on the ideas that you are putting out there and the framework that you're providing legally? Is there any state at the forefront?
Okay. So first, with respect to the 1%, the 1% is the net annual cost. It is not a one-time thing. It is every year, and and just for the U.S. transformation, and it is net of the cost that would otherwise go into fossil fuel. So there would be a lot of money over the coming decades that would be spent building natural gas pipelines and everything else for fossil fuel infrastructure and for buying the fuel. And so those expenditures would not happen. The excess of the expenditures for the clean energy economy we're talking about, minus the fossil fuel, would be 1%. U.S. spends about 1% of its gross national product collecting and disposing of garbage. It is a tiny fraction of what the U.S. spent on war production in World War II. We can show you the numbers, but it's a surprisingly low percentage of the economy. We have a massive economy. We build all kinds of stuff, and all of this can be built at that kind of cost. In terms of whether we need a change in the larger economy, I wish I could tell you that I see the legal or political pathway to that. But I think that a substantial carbon price would accomplish a lot in terms of making it much more expensive to engage in excess consumption. And I think that that would take us a long way. California has been the leader for a long time. Schwarzenegger signed the big law in 1987, the Global Warming Solutions Act. The first draft of the New York State law was drafted by us, by the Saban Center, and we modeled parts of it after the California law. It went through a lot of changes since then. But the same basic idea that an entity is given the job of coming up with a plan. There is California Air Resources Board, here's this climate task force, but California has long been a leader. Governor Cuomo announced at the signing ceremony last week he wants New York to surge ahead of California. I very much hope that happens, but I think in order for that to happen, it requires continual pressure on the government. Citizen pressure was very successful in getting the governor to ban fracking.
Yes.
And so I think that the same kind of pressure has to be exerted to make sure that this law is fully implemented.
More questions?
I have two somewhat unrelated questions. We talked about both these legal pathways and the program. Is that being offered in states other than at this point? Is your focus in New York State? Because I'm in New Jersey. We'd love to put solar panels on the roof. The association would not approve it. I'm like, oh, this is well. But just generally, that's your intent to grow up next to New York State. Second question relating to your book. I'm more of a science type, and I don't know if I can read the book. It's hard enough to read books on science, but I don't know if I can read a book on the law. I read your slides; they're excellent. So help me understand. Should we just get the slide presentation, or should we? Is the book understandable by a person?
Other questions?
Thanks again. I've heard this effort compared to being an ALEC for climate action. ALEC is a conservative legislative group that's been very successful in getting Republican state legislators to pass model bills that they draft. And so I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about kind of the final stage of this project. Once the model legislation is available and has been reviewed, what that legislative advocacy looks like to get local, state, federal policymakers on board. And if you started to think through, similar to the way you kind of divided up labor in the drafting process, what types of activism groups might be involved in the final stage?
That's my favorite question. Yes?
Yes, I wondered if I'd like to know if you have included embodied carbon in your calculations. And also, are you saying that with the 1%, no longer will there be any funds going to incentives or whatever they're called, funds going to fossil fuel companies near?
Great. So that's 3, and we'll keep going. How are we doing on time? So go ahead.
So are the legal pathways New York only? I mean, what we're doing right now is drafting model laws that we think could be adopted in the state. They would require a lot of adjustments in each state to reflect that state's laws. But the idea is to create laws that could be used as a template.
Michael, I think she was talking about the legal defense program.
Oh, so if you're, and with respect to the legal defense initiative, if somebody were to come to us from New Jersey needing help, we would look at that and we would try to recruit a pro bono lawyer in New Jersey. I'm only admitted in New York, but we would try to find people in other places to work with us, and we've gotten a lot of interest in doing that. With respect to how technical the book is, there's also an abridged version. That's a mere 160 pages, and that is available for free download from the Environmental Law Institute. And if you have difficulty finding it, let me know, and I'll send you the link. But that's much more bite size.
We've been sending that out quite a bit, so you should be getting it.
That's right. I guess it was attached to the announcement that you sent out.
So we have.
You're right. This has been compared to ALEC, and you rightly characterized what ALEC is. So we're not there yet. And when I say the we, this is just a few of us doing this work entirely for free. We have neither my co-editor nor I, we both waived royalties. All the lawyers that did all this drafting did it on a pro bono basis. So we do not have the organization to go out there and promote this in every state. We hope that some of you will help engage in that, but that's an organization that is actually needed. We'll try to help, but we don't have the ability to go out and do that. With respect to embedded carbon, I mean, there is a chapter on industrial production and how to reduce the amount of carbon that is embedded in goods. And this issue also comes up with respect to international trade. If we think about a border tariff issue, carbon becomes a very important, difficult issue to calculate.
And the funding
Okay.
of the fossil fuel companies.
Oh, the subsidy.
Oh, so yeah, we do recommend elimination of fossil fuel subsidies, and that's a very important part.
Calculated to be $4.6 billion a year over there.
So you're saying that carbon pricing is essential, I understand, essential feature of the agenda, but the citizen climate lobby has been pushing carbon fee dividend free, at which they say that economic studies can reduce carbon emissions 90% by 2050. Their bill contains a regulatory clause, a 10-year regulatory clause, to see if the emissions target. It means that EPA would not be able to regulate carbon emissions for in that period. So I guess my question is, how do you know, what's your take? Is it unrealistic, this projection of citizen climate lobby that emissions will be reduced 90% by 2050? This bill, therefore, is very important. Do you pause regulation for 10 years? Or is it you're going to need carbon pricing in addition to another suite of regulation?
Thank you. Other questions? We're running out of questions. That means we've done a great job. Okay. Well, okay. Go ahead. What's your follow-up question?
Okay. Have you done anything about externalities in terms of the fossil fuel industry and the emissions and the consequent health issues that come out of those emissions?
And then I'll add one more question. If you could talk a little bit about the FAST Act that happened under Obama and the placement of renewable energy on government land.
Okay, so it's my understanding that the pricing dividend bill that you're talking about doesn't eliminate all EPA regulations, just some of them. I think that it would leave in place the motor vehicle standards, which are very important. It would put a pause on certain regulations, such as coal-fired power plants, which is what the Clean Power Plan would have done. Those are on the way out anyway, and a price on carbon would have the effect of eliminating. They would all be rendered severely uneconomic. I don't know about the 90% by 2050. I don't think I've seen that number, but I don't think that a carbon price alone will do everything, and I don't think that that bill thinks that a carbon price would do everything. It would do much. But we need all these other things. I mean, one important example that I went to, the Cape Wind project that was supposed to be a Cape Wind project off Cape Cod, Nantucket, was proposed in 2001 and ultimately died in 2015 after years and years of litigation, changes in the regulatory requirements, and so forth. The developer continued to have an incentive to want to build it. The carbon price wouldn't have made any difference. There were all these other obstacles that were thrown away. And so even if you have a carbon price, you're going to need a lot of action to remove these other obstacles. With respect to externalities from the fossil fuel industry, well, the hope is that we will, by decarbonizing, will greatly reduce not only the greenhouse gases, but the conventional air pollutants and also the coal mining and the oil spills and everything else that creates these negative externalities. So far it's the litigation against the negative externalities that has been most successful on the litigation front in shutting down the coal-fired power plants, not the greenhouse gas emissions. So the FAST Act was an act passed by Congress and signed by President Obama in November of 2015, that was designed to expedite the approval process for all kinds of energy projects, fossil as well as renewables, highways, all other kinds of infrastructure. It has not been implemented much. It gave a lot of power to an officer that the White House was supposed to appoint, and it took a long time to appoint him. And when Trump came in, it took him a long time to do it. So it has not so far been effective, but it is a tool that is now on the books. And so if we get a president who wants to build a lot of wind and solar, he or she can actually use that to expedite. There is legislation that has been pending in Congress for some years with bipartisan support to make it easier to build renewable on public land, particularly Bureau of Land Management land, of which there's a massive amount. That actually has a chance of going through even in this Congress. The public land is renewable energy. There are a number of other bills out there that have been introduced. Some of them have enough bipartisan support that they have a chance of going through. Others, no chance with this Congress, but if things change, the next Congress and the next president, a lot to do.
How are we doing on time? We're running out of time. It seems like we're out of time. So we can, at the end of the meeting, one more question? Do we have time for one? There's only seems one left. We'll ask it after the meeting if that's okay. Because we do have a lot more to go to. But anyway, thank you so much, Michael, for all this exciting work. Great. All right. Well, going on with our agenda, we're going to invite Rachel Goodgal up, and she's going to talk us through a little bit more of what the working group is up to, so folks can see how to plug in and just see a little bit more of the work behind the scenes. I think I have the document here.
Hi everyone, I'm Rachel. Thanks. I do a lot of administrative stuff for the People's Green New Deal Working Group, connecting everyone to their teammates and making sure a spreadsheet stays looking nice, all kinds of great stuff like that. So as Todd noted earlier, we are working on a project that aims to collect proposals from far and wide throughout the environmental movement, see what everybody wants, collect it in one place across sectors, and to help unite the movement. So this spreadsheet is basically becoming a database of recommendations. We've researched about 50 proposals so far, and our wonderful teams have been going through them, parsing them out, finding recommendations in all of their sectors. So we have teams on all the different topics Todd talked about before, all the sort of see them on the sheet. Can everybody who's here who's on a team raise your hand? Yay! Wow. We have a great group. We can always use more help, so you can talk to me if you are not in the group and want to be, and I'll connect you with an appropriate team. And our teams have been doing wonderful work so far, and I think without further ado, I have two team leaders who are going to give you a little overview of what their groups have been doing. We have Sandy from the transportation group and Lalo from the land use group. So let's bring up Sandy.
Here it is. You can see the tabs along the bottom are all the different pages on the topics. I'm going to pull up transportation.
So I just wanted to talk for just a second about how I ended up picking transportation. When I came to the working group, I thought, what I'm really interested in is food and agriculture. And it turned out that there were a whole bunch of other people interested in food and agriculture too, and not very many people in transportation. So I thought, well, let me go where I'm needed. And, I took a look at drawdown initially, and I don't know if you remember the pie chart that Todd put up early on, but transportation only made up about 4% of the pie, representing carbon emissions. But what you need to know is that pie was a global pie, not a U.S. pie. And I've actually been pushing very much for a U.S. pie, which I think they're working on. But all the work that I've looked at so far, and I think if you remember from the Saban presentation that was just made, 33% of carbon emissions in New York State are from transportation, and I think it's the #1 source of carbon emissions, and it may be the #1 source of carbon emissions in the U.S. So I was actually very happy to find out that transportation was more important than I initially thought. So there's been a lot of learning going on. So I just wanted to give you a couple of examples of some of the proposals that I found in some of the policy initiatives that I found kind of interesting. One in particular was the AOC Markey Green New Deal letter that had been endorsed by 600 environmental groups. There were a whole host of policy proposals in that document, but one of the ones that kind of struck me, because it's very conservative, doesn't even require passing any new laws, which means that if we didn't take over the Senate and we just got a new president, a lot of this stuff could actually happen, and that is utilizing the Clean Air Act to put limits on greenhouse gases for every sector of transportation. And that appears in this document for ships, cars, trucks, airplanes. And that's something, that does not require the passage of a new law. I put that in sort of the conservative category, and I was kind of surprised to find something like that. So I thought that was kind of interesting. One of the other policy proposals that kind of struck me was from the Drawdown 100, which doesn't have a lot of policy proposals, but they did have one related to high-speed rail, and that was, to expand electricity-powered high-speed rail. And in parentheses, and I need to look into this a little bit more myself, but they said currently there is only 28 miles of high-speed rail in the United States, which just blew my mind. 28 miles. I'm not sure whether it's maybe in the aborted LA San Francisco project in California, but 28 miles just blew my mind. And then a third one that I just thought was kind of interesting. This is, I think, a little pie in the sky, but it comes from the Democratic Socialists of America National Ecological Socialist Work Group and a trade union for energy and democracy group. And they're recommending fare-free public transportation. Obviously very aspirational, but very much in line of the kind of thing that would go a long way toward promoting the kinds of behavior that we like. Obviously there were tons of things related to electrification, but that just gives you, it's been a lot of fun. I've learned a lot, and I would encourage anybody else who wants to learn and contribute to think about joining the work group.
Thank you so much. Now we have Lalo, who's the leader of the land use group.
Hi, my name is Lalo. I'm working in this group. A lot of the proposals here come from the Saban Center. I think it has to be decarbonization. Recently, I ran into an article by Grist that points out a lot of proposals that involve, ocean, the NOAA funding, funding them a bit better, funding, national parks a bit better to avoid, both to reforest a lot of the areas in the U.S. and to control forest fires more effectively. Because there's no point of making all these reductions in carbon when a really out of control fire can undo all that essentially. Some notes. And a lot of all comes from enforcing the clean water rule from the EPA. Chris is suggesting having a blue carbon fund to promote carbon capture in the oceans. Apparently, having seaweed, having seaweed farms and other restorative ecosystems being, promoted in coastal areas can help to capture carbon a lot more, 5 times more than land forests. USDA promoting, this is from the Saban Center, promoting a wood product certification system that allows companies to prove that their products are carbon neutral or even carbon positive if possible. And there's there's a lot in this, a lot of proposals. A lot of them overlap with food and ag. A lot overlap with buildings and other infrastructure, and a lot of them are connected to promoting indigenous, land. And yeah, they're all here. There are about 40 of them. So if you want to join our group for more, that'll be great. Thank you.
So as you can see, just from these two examples, or two of our, I think, 9 subgroups, they're collecting proposals from a wide variety of sources, and they're accepting. We're bringing ideas together. Like Sandy mentioned, the fair free public transportation. We're not making our own judgment that's going to pass or not. We say, okay, great, a beautiful idea. Let's put this in our database so that we get a sense of what's going on in different sectors. So we'd love to have any more members talk to me. If you don't have a lot of time to commit to a new group, but you want to help with our project, one very easy thing you can do is go to the website. Todd, can I have the website? It's okay if not. It's on the 350nyc.org and the People's Green New Deal Working Group. There's an intake form that we have sent out, as Todd said, to many different grassroots organizations. But if you are connected to a grassroots environmental or academic policy organization of any kind, please send them our intake form so that they can submit their proposal and we can bring it on in. I think that's it for me. Thank you.
So I'm just going to wrap up with a couple comments about macro movement strategy. It's great to have all these ideas. Let's see, what did I say? As I mentioned earlier, there are thousands of environmental groups all working on pieces of this puzzle. And collectively, I believe that they could have a substantial impact in passing legislation, whereas individually, we've arguably been somewhat powerless. So there was one bill in 2010 for a carbon scheme that didn't pass, and there's been nothing since then. Meanwhile, the opposition of big oil, ag, and farm are very much united and controlling the show in Congress, as we all know. Examples are oil and gas tax subsidies of $4.6 billion on an industry that's profitable and doesn't need that, obviously. That they can pass an ag-gag rule that makes it illegal for you to film the way in which your food and animal agriculture takes place, and to arrest and criminalize activists who try to bring that information to the public. GMO labeling, regardless of what you think about it, it was completely ineffective, the effort to get that done. In fact, they were able to pass a federal law that bans states from even requiring GMO labeling, something that is standard practice in Europe. Pesticides and bees. In Europe, they banned all sorts of pesticides that are killing the bees, and then also depleting the ability of the soils to do carbon capture. So in the United States, the EPA right now is again, under Trump, relaxing restraints on those kinds of pesticides. So the failure of Congress to act to even touch climate over the last several decades is further proof of the disproportionate political power that the opposition has. So it's my assessment that we have to unite. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but I think we're in an emergency organizing moment for the climate and for the planet. So this is a list of 10 suggestions, but I'm just going to mention one, the Emergency Climate Coalition. There's currently, to my knowledge, no formal federal coalition of big green environmental groups. I worked in the New York Immigration Coalition for a couple of years on behalf of gay couples. They have an office here in New York with 36 staff people, legal, policy, organizers. They can do a march on DC in a couple months if they want. They don't need to spend 6 months organizing a march and then all go home and do nothing else. They passed comprehensive immigration reform through the Senate with amnesty under Obama. Keep that in mind, do that. And then the House, of course, blocked that because they wanted to keep this political issue alive for the politics, which you're seeing play out today. But that coalition, the New York Immigration Coalition, has the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops on it, National Association of Evangelicals, all the way through to the ACLU. We need a comprehensive federal climate coalition that has 100 staff to get started. I think the Big Greens should donate 10% of their budgets to this and fund it with business-minded folks who are planning, who could come up with a plan to go after the votes in all of the districts, who can get the legislative directors from all these organizations working on in-district plans together, who can get the lawyers from all these organizations to work on coming to agreement on what the federal bill should be. It's really, frankly, a travesty that we don't have this basic level of infrastructure at the federal level. So with such an infrastructure, we could then approach the PR and marketing industry of New York and say, help us promote the timeline, the emergency timeline, the solutions, and the legislation that we come up with. I'd like to call it the Earth Bill, get us out of some of the backlash from the Green New Deal terminology. But an Earth Bill would, I think, resonate, particularly if it had all the components from all the sectors that we're talking about. And then we could launch a massive public awareness campaign to bring all the willing people out there who care deeply about this topic. And I've seen it when I march in Pride and carry a climate sign. I'm shocked at the reaction of the crowd. The public will is out there. They just need a solution that they can work with and get behind, that they will then put their lives on the line for. Hundreds of people are getting arrested in New York. Hundreds of people got arrested to pass the New York bill at different moments. 70 people just got arrested outside the New York Times office with Extinction Rebellion. They are waiting to lay their lives on the line for the planet, but until we have a federal demand that we have a cohesive plan behind, there's nothing to lay your life on the line for. You know, and all of you I know would be there if we had this in mode. So I would suggest that we convene emergency organizing summits this fall and bring together as many groups as we can. And we've talked about solutions ad nauseum. Let's talk about the political science of this problem and how we're going to organize ourselves nationally and through a network of state connections so that we have an actual plan to pass legislation. And in New York City, I think we should create a climate central war room. We had one last summer called Climate Action Mondays that we led with 350 and Food and Water Watch. And every Monday night we were there going after candidates to make sure they were supporting the All Fossil Fuels Act, which we don't have anymore, but making sure that they were on board with federal legislation. So whatever our bill is, we want to go after the candidates to make sure that they're on board with it. And then we want to drive the climate vote to the polls to make sure that we're delivering our power to make sure we have the Congress we need to do the work that we need to do. So that's it. I think celebrities are not going to save us. As excited as we are about some of the big names that are popping up and some of the notoriety that people like Greta Thunberg are bringing to this, it's absolutely wonderful. Ocasio-Cortez is amazing. Without her, we wouldn't be where we are in this conversation, which is frankly a miracle from where we were a year ago. But they are not going to save us by themselves. They can't, and they know that. So we have to unite as activists for critical political power and critical mass with a clear, unified set of policy demands, because this is a unique opportunity to topple the oligarchy that controls our Congress. And it's only because of this emergency circumstances and this unusual combination of thousands of activists and passionate people that we have the opportunity to really go in there and win this fight. So, but we are only going to be able to seize that if we act together. So we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing differently now as organizers than what we have been doing for the last several decades, for the last few years? We need to think new organizing models. So going beyond separate meetings, which are wonderful, but how many of you go to meetings all the time with 40 or 50 people? We need to be having meetings with 200 people in them, going after districts and candidates and really getting in the nitty-gritty of the action. We need to build superstructures, infrastructure, a flow chart of all the connections we have. We have, all of you have thousands of connections. It's unbelievable how many talented, able people there are with really amazing connections, but we're not working together yet. So we have to build that infrastructure and have this shared vision, because I believe together we can't save life on Earth as we know it, but only if we work together. So I'm welcoming you all to that challenge. We have a very exciting few years ahead of us. The hope is that this year we will do all the work we're doing. By 2020, we will have federal legislation in play again, and then we will work really hard next year on the elections, of course, and that by 2021, we will be positioned as a movement and as a country to pass substantial climate legislation. So thank you very much. That's the end of this part of the presentation. And welcome other thoughts.
Okay, Eric Arnhem is going to give a brief presentation on a wonderful project he's working on called the Climate Solutions Digest. So another wonderful resource for people who are looking.
Thank you, Monica. Thanks all of you for being here. It's a great segue from what Michael Gerrard and Todd were talking about to what I want to talk about a little bit. Because it was a couple of months ago, I was at Todd's first media group meeting. Was that January or February? It was a while ago, anyway. And half the people in the room, they were complaining that nobody's writing about climate solutions. And the other half of the people in the room were complaining that they don't know where to find, what to read, what to do, it's hard to keep up with all the news and all the publications. So, while I was sitting there, an idea popped into my head. What if there was a Reader's Digest for climate solutions news? So that's what I want to launch. I'm calling it Climate Solutions Digest, and here's how it's going to work. Drawdown, there's a copy of the book in the back there. Drawdown has organized the whole world of climate solutions into 7 different sectors. Todd pointed them out. Buildings, electricity, food, land use, materials, transportation, and women and girls. And under each of those headings, they've identified a total of, I guess, about 100 different solutions. What I've done is I've given each one a unique hashtag. So, for instance, hashtag solar for solar energy, hashtag trees for anything to do with forestry or forest management or sequestration through planting trees. Hashtag trucks will, look at diesel and transportation, things like that. I took the list of about 100 different solutions. I condensed it down to about 80 by, combining things like onshore and offshore wind. There's no reason, you can put them together under the heading wind. And then I had to add some for things like student strikes, protests, lawsuits, geoengineering. There's some really wacky solutions out there. One of them, they want to blot out the sun with this sort of confetti that makes it cooler on Earth. There's another one, they want to bring snowmaking machines to Antarctica to replace all the icebergs falling off. But there's solutions, And then there's one big solution that I have to add in there that Drawdown's not going to do, Michael Gerrard's not going to do it, Todd's not going to do it. Denial. That's a solution. I mean, how do you quickly solve a problem? Well, you say there's no problem. Problem solved, right? It goes away. So, I mean, there's a lot of people saying that there's not a climate emergency. It's the hottest day ever in Belgium today, and in Holland today, in France. Paris is going to have the hottest day ever tomorrow. It's out of control out there. And I don't know. But anyway, I'm collecting news, headlines, articles from hundreds of different publications all over the world, anything in English. I wish I could do Spanish, French, German, Japanese, Chinese, but I don't speak it. If any of you have any familiarity there, we can probably find some crude translations to help us with that. What I'm doing is I'm reading the article, really scanning it, not reading every word, but getting a gist of what the article's about and giving it a hashtag or giving it a couple of hashtags, like there might be one about renewable energy that mentions hydro, wind, and solar, so they get 3 hashtags. They might mention planting trees as well, so that would be the 4th one. I'm now up to the letter N, having looked through all the publications that I can find. I did, just in the past couple of days, NPR, NBC News, National Geographic, and The Nation. I should get to Z in a couple of weeks, but then I'll have to go back to the beginning because of all the stuff that came out in June, late June, and all through the month of July. This is where I need your help. I didn't want to show you the publication yet. I didn't want to show you the database yet. I just wanted to appeal to you for your help. For months, I've been very closely watching the 350 NYC discussion board. I hope you're all also a member of that. But anytime that any of you posts anything, like here's an interesting story, that goes right into my queue to, process that and put that into the database. So, without knowing it, you've been feeding the database, and in some cases, it's not just the article that you show me, it's the whole publication. I just learned of one, John posted something, I guess, about a week ago, 2 weeks ago, Science Digest, no, Science Daily? Science Daily. I have 100 different headlines from that already. I had no idea it even existed till last week. Now I'm finding they've been writing about climate solutions on a daily basis almost. So this is what I'm asking you. When you post those links, when you find an interesting article, please put in the headline, please put in the name of the publication, and maybe the date, or something like that, just so that I can check to see, is it in the database already, or is it not? Is it the same or different from something that somebody else has already shown me? I'll add that into the database, and it'll go in there. If you find lots of clippings, if it starts to get too heavy, too many, just email them to me. My email address, earnum@rcm.com, and I'll give that to you in person as well. And I'll be watching the discussion group, so just say something there. So as the database gears up for a mid-August launch, we're going to debut it on 4 different channels. There's going to be email, Facebook, Twitter, and the web. Each will have a different form, different format, different functions. For instance, the email channel is going to, well, when you go to sign up for the email channel, I'll ask you, of those 7 different sectors that drawdown has, transportation, electricity, buildings, whatever, which ones are you interested in? You can choose 1, you can choose 7, you can choose 3, you can choose 4, whatever you like. Every second and 4th Sunday, anything new in the database is going into an email and going to you. Twice a month. Do you think that's too often or not often enough, or?
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Because, I mean,
it would be overwhelming. Once a week is too much.
Well, I get one now in Irina. It's a daily.
I got a 350, which is daily.
That's what I mean. I don't want to overwhelm people.
Twice a month.
Twice a month?
Yeah, it's good to know.
And then
Depends on how many entries there are. It's like 20 or 30, 40 things. Not to look at it at all.
well, here's a good judgment of that. I've only really been looking for headlines that came out since the IPCC study in October, the one that said 1.5 degrees. I figured that was sort of like, that was the line in the sand. Where was it? They said, we only have till 2030 to do something. So it was really, that's when the emergency was declared. So since then I've collected, well, from A to N, I've collected about 2,500 different headlines for 10 months. So that's 250 a month, that's 8 a day or something like that, I don't know. And these are all about solutions. I try not to do the stuff about the polar bears or the ice melting in Greenland. Because, I mean, although it's worrying, it doesn't reduce carbon emissions. That's the thing. There's lots of talk about climate change that doesn't actually do anything, that doesn't actually move the ball down the field. And some of it actually moves the ball back, the denial stuff, stripping the coal and things like that. One more thing I wanted to mention to you. Well, of course, most important thing, this is all going to be free. It's impossible to, well, no, it's not impossible to make people pay on the internet. But that's part of the problem. That's the second thing I wanted to mention to you, is that I've run into 8 different publications that have some sort of paywall, or they have some maximum count of how many free articles you can get per month or something like that. Bloomberg News, The Economist, The Irish Times, Los Angeles Times, New York Times, The Nation, New Yorker, and Scientific American. I need help with these. I don't know what to do. You know, I can't, you know, it's going to be a free effort, and I'm not looking for money. I'm not going to try to spend money, but these are expensive subscriptions. So if any of you already subscribe to any of these publications and you have access, you know, please be my eyes and ears. And if you see something in the New Yorker that's really interesting, tell me about it and send me the link so that, you know, I can get it into the database. As I said, I'm looking for a mid-August launch, so I think that's like August 11th. The subscription system is being developed now. I should launch that in a couple of weeks. What I'm hoping is that people can use this to find out what's everybody working on. You know, who's working on which solutions? What's been done in France? What's been done in Australia? You know, how can we collaborate? How can we cross-pollinate our knowledge? How can we find out what's going on? How can we keep track? So at some point in the future, I'll show you more in depth. But that's what I wanted to ask you is first, when you read something interesting, please put it into the discussion group. And second, if you have access to any of these paywall publications, please help me out. Thank you very much.
A very quick update, Dorian's going to update us on PCM meeting, and then John on divestment. Do we have something on divestment, John?
Really, we don't need to do investment.
We don't.